Did a social media ban light a fuse for the next generation already fed up with corruption? And why is it that the world should care? We're seeing Nepal, France, and protests happening all over the world, and somehow there is not much change happening.
Let's talk about it. And if you haven't already, remember to hit subscribe so you don't miss our upcoming episodes. Your support is what keeps us going. Also, the Rethinking Tech survey is live. Please fill it out. When you tell us what you want, we do a better job of actually giving you what you want. Welcome back to Rethinking Tech. I'm Aparna.
And I'm Harinda.
Our podcast breaks the topic of tech apart,
covering the surprising connections to geopolitics, business, and ethics.
We are both humanitarians, and I'm a lawyer, currently on my second Freddo Espresso in Athens.
And I'm a former entrepreneur, globetrotter, and, well, I've probably had quite a few coffees as well.
Every week, we break down the hottest tech topics that you need to know about. Today, we're talking about the protests that took over all of the news sources this past week and are happening in Nepal. We're going to provide some context to tell you why we're talking about it, what the tech implications are, what the geopolitical implications are, and then, my favorite, what this means ethically. Harinda, why does this topic matter?
So protests have been happening in Nepal because there were, first off, social media bans that were limiting communications between the people abroad, but also people being able to voice their concerns publicly. And the government did that under the guise of saying, well, these social media companies were supposed to run through, because of recent legislation, registering locally and going through a number of bureaucratic steps. And as a result, they had decided, okay, well, because they didn't, we're going to start cutting them off. And there's dozens of social media companies that were actually stopped. So it's not just the mainstream ones. But at the same time, one of the interesting things is some of these companies, TikTok, Meta, they had actually gone through the bureaucratic steps and done what was needed, even at some expense, but it still didn't matter. Some of them still got cut off. And that's a problem because that just got everybody really fuming, and they took to the streets. They started with riots. They started with burning. Even the parliament had a massive fire of smoke coming out. But it's not just that. It was also fueled by the fact that there's rampant corruption at the government level that people are just sick and tired from. Now, again, we see this happening a lot. We've seen it over many years. All of this energy and anger and angst was basically just fuming, and it caught fire, all happening across Nepal.
And it was the tip of the iceberg. This was so much more than the social media ban. There were years of unhappiness. There's great income inequality. And this is where the term Nepo kids, hashtag Nepo kids, really came to surface in Nepal. And that's why a lot of people think the social media platforms were shut down, because images, videos are being further propagated into the World Wide Web for people to see this awful misuse of funding by government officials while people in the country were literally starving. I lived in Nepal for a year. I lived in Kathmandu. Nepalis are some of the kindest, most soft-hearted, most welcoming people I've ever met. And then to turn on my TV and see that their entire country was in disarray and that there were protests in the street, I knew something really bad must have happened. And I cannot even imagine the years of unhappiness, the years of unrest that resulted in all this culminating into this past week's activities, where now, to date, 30 people have died.
And one of the things that I want to talk about, and I want to take this directly into the geopolitical part of the discussion, because we are also seeing huge riots happening in France. There's a huge movement against Macron right now. He's on his fourth prime minister in over a year. This is a huge problem because people are just fed up of him. And again, his mandate still allows him to stay in place for quite some time, even though those protests are happening. And some of them are also getting quite violent. One of the things that I keep wondering is how valuable are protests? And I'll tell you why I'm asking this question. So I, of course, go to my new best friend, ChatGPT, and I had to ask it, what are the most successful protests in recent history that instituted lasting change that was asked for by protesters? And the first one that comes up is the civil rights movement. And it was the end of racial segregation, and there's an entry of voting rights, and all of these things. And I'm fast forwarding to 2025, and I'm actually wondering whether you can go to the United States and ask a lot of the African-American population whether they feel that those protests got the result that was required or desired. In the Philippines, there's a people power revolution in 1986, and they had removed the dictator Ferdinand Marcos. And guess what? The family's back in power. Arab Spring in 2011, 2012, where a number of North African countries went in massive protests, massive rioting across those countries. In 2025, many of these have dictatorships back in place. And this is the reason I'm asking, how valuable do you think protests are?
I believe that protests are extremely important. Without protests, you allow a government to determine your entire future, your entire livelihood, what that means for generations to come, and you don't use the voice that you have. Protesting means that you're unhappy with the way things are. If you don't protest, that means you're okay with the way way things are. That means that you're okay with status quo. You're okay with the government acting the way it is, and that's totally fine. If you actually are totally fine, don't use your voice. But if you are unhappy, do something about it. Do the protest. But protesting is not enough in and of itself. Overthrowing a government is not enough in and of itself. There needs to be more. There needs to be an action plan. What is this going to look like 5 years in the future, 10 years in the future? In terms of the civil rights movement, 100, 200, 300 years in the future, you need to establish some sort of institution, some sort of foundation, some sort of governance to actually legitimately cause change.
I was in Turin a few weeks ago, and there was a protest in one of the major squares in which they had basically set up a tent and they were protesting, in the name of Gaza. And one of the things that I realized is that there's been a decay of the definition of protest. So, okay, there are riots that are happening, and that is one thing. But all I saw there were a few guys and the girls hanging out, drinking a few beers and scrolling through Instagram. And I don't think that is now anymore the relevant theme of how to protest. But I think that this is one of the things that people have not understood what you were saying earlier. What is important is organizing. I'm still of the camp that protesting is not effective. I go back to Occupy, I go to the anti-Trump protest that happened. I go back to so many and countless examples, and I just cannot think of genuinely long-lasting changes that have come about from it. There's something broken between the communication of a protest and the democratic or diplomatic or even bureaucratic process that is required to implement change at a national or local level.
Again, protesting alone is not enough. Occupy Wall Street. A lot of people were really cold waiting outside Wall Street. But what was the end goal? What was going to happen? And unfortunately, that wasn't thought out. Was there attention drawn to the movement? Yes. But what did you do with that attention? And that's what I'm talking about. It's not protests that are ineffective. It's the lack of follow through. It's the lack of actually implementing effective change. I mean, there are examples of countries where there were student protests that did result in change. I'm thinking of Bangladesh in 1990. There were mass student and public protests, and General Ershad at the time resigned. That's an example where civic pressure led to regime change. You and I have talked about Sri Lanka before, but hey, months of mass protest in 2022, country in complete disarray, and they forced the dynasty out of power. I'll let you say what you want to say in a second. But I'm also then reminded of in Indonesia, I believe it was 1998, another student-led movement. It's always the students. It's always the people who are educated. It's always the people who feel like their lives are in jeopardy and they need to make the change. Another example of movements toppling authoritarian rule.
I do appreciate the efforts that people go through to voice their concerns, to articulate what it is that they are completely in disagreement over. I also was thinking about the Gaza protests that were happening in the United States at the universities. I think that one of the things that's really difficult is that there's an imbalance of power. And then the second thing is that most of the protests are actually just shifted off as riots, and as a result are not organized to have very concrete demands. Now, don't get me wrong, you have short-term change, right? In Sri Lanka, they literally chased out of the country the former president, prime minister, a minister of finance, who were three brothers, and still, I fast forward a few years later, and they're back in the government, in power, with no real damage to their reputation. And so the reason I keep thinking about this is not whether you think it's right or wrong. I really wonder the effectiveness of it. If you could take that anger, if you could take that communication power, if you could take that sheer volume of people and route it in a completely different route, I wonder if they could organize to change government. And that's the problem, is I don't see that the protests could be lasting in change if they organize in that way. But I think that there is just this desire to vent, which I get, don't get me wrong. But once you vent, it doesn't actually create discourse.
Well, let's look at Nepal as an example. They're going through this process right now. They just got rid of their prime minister and 4 ministers. Their finance minister got fly kicked out by an angry mob. But they have now implemented themselves Nepal's former chief justice. Her name is Sushila Karki, and she herself had actually joined the protests. So she's now been put nominally in charge. She was chosen by the people over Discord, a server that had been banned, but somehow people managed to use it, probably through VPNs or whatever. And they quote unquote elected her. And she herself has said that she is going to be in for a short time and help the country get towards a new start. This is them choosing a leader. This is them putting someone in place. And this is them now trying to shape the government that they actually want to be governed by.
And that's great. I think that's really positive. And the part that I'm always a skeptic of is that if we fast forward 5, 7, not even 10 years, will we still have a huge problem of corruption? Will we still have a huge problem in which there's misappropriated funds at the government level? And my answer is going to be categorically yes. And that's the reason that I get upset when I see so many talented people, so many volumes of people just going out, trying to voice their concerns, but it's just not the right channel. I wonder whether there is that genuine depth of discourse. And I say this also because when I was at Harvard a few years ago and I was speaking talking to the dean of one of the faculties there, and he was basically saying one of the biggest concerns that we have, and this was just before those university protests happened, and he was saying one of the biggest concerns we have is we're really struggling with the ability of having people with different opinions come together and talk. And that was a huge problem for the campus, for the dean, and for the university itself. And so I sort of fast forward with so much of this, where I try to understand what is that right channel, at least reestablish discourse, because we're in diplomacy, we work in the UN, and have done so much of the work there. I'm a big believer in diplomacy, and I just feel like communication channels have been cut.
I mean, people now mock the UN as a form of diplomacy. Before, that was one place to talk. That was one place to have these conversations. And right now, discourse is being mocked. That's literally what it means, having these conversations. It's almost like this is the time, this is the era for the championing of egos, for the championing of machismo, for the championing of pushing your thoughts, your ideals, your values down the throats of everyone else. And anyone who disagrees is, to use other people's terms, the terms of political leaders, stupid, wrong, inaccurate, or idiots. So those are not very diplomatic terms. It's kind of like it's my way or the highway. And we're seeing the pendulum swim so far away from diplomacy that my only hope is that it will swing back. But I want to come back to this point that you made. You said lasting change. What causes lasting change? And to that, I did a bit of digging. And I realized that when we do see change, and I'm not sure if it's lasting enough, but we see it lasting beyond at least a few years, it's often when there's this elite power that has been in place, and then someone from that elite power defects. They realize that they are in the wrong, or they realize that this has gone too far, and they start speaking to the people. They become one of the people. Or when there's clear leadership alternatives. And ideally, there's no military force involved. Once you involve the military, then it could become a military state. So when you have those regimes that are very close to military ranks, that's often when they fail.
The point you just made is really interesting. For a number of reasons, it's really hard to be able to have somebody in power come to this epiphany that lasting change needs to happen. And it's not that it's never happened, but it's just really difficult for the sheer volume of protests that are out there. I was looking at the Carnegie Endowment Organization, which has basically created a global protest tracker. The reason I'm mentioning this is they name countries from Afghanistan all the way to the United States. I can't imagine that there's going to be leaders that are in power and then will defect and move to support the people.
It happens on Disney. I don't understand. You're saying Disney isn't real life? We can't get away from talking about geopolitics without addressing the geopolitics of Nepal itself and what this means. So Nepal, tiny country sandwiched between China and India, massive nations. And for the longest time, Nepal had been leaning towards India. So China wasn't too happy about that. That's a country right on its border that's allied with one of its, I don't want to say enemies, but we'll say frenemies. And recently, in the current regime, we actually saw the pendulum swing the other direction, where the government was very much pro-China. So now, with this regime change in place, Sushila Karki, the inaugural leader of this party that is not in existence yet, was actually giving an interview to an Indian channel. So while all of this is playing out in the local Nepali community, we're seeing geopolitics at play. We're seeing India probably very happy that all this is happening. We're seeing China probably trying to figure out a way to retaliate and react and understand how to get control. So when we think about conflict and we think about local discourse and we think about protests, we also need to think about what this sends out as a signal globally. It sends out that your country is in disarray, that there's space for another world power to come in and try to take control, that there's space for alliances to be formed and reformed.
These are super important points because, in fact, it's usually when a nation is weak, usually when a person is weak, that external forces are able to take advantage of that. And I think that this is it's an important and not an underserved point. Let's transition over quickly onto technology, right? So I think that there's also an important discussion to be had because a key move that governments make when they are seeing a gap between government direction and the people's volition. So what is it that people want? We see that the governments start cutting access to social media. And usually the gap has to be quite large. And that's a really important factor because from a government perspective, it's actually a really clever play, right? They need to mute the voices so that it doesn't have the snowball effect. But at the same time, one of the things that social media also allows people to do, other than organize themselves, is to actually vent, get all of that frustration and angst out with the likes of the contentious posts and things like that, which is also one of the ways to dissipate some of this frustration. And I think it's really important for us to now think about, the importance of social media in society that is not just fueling protests, but at the same time, one of the things that could calm things down.
And it's about so much more than social media, right? It's about things like commerce. WhatsApp runs a lot of small to medium businesses, tiny businesses. You'll go into villages and you'll see shacks with nothing on them other than a WhatsApp logo and a phone number. That is their marketing. That is their form of communicating. You'll see people who previously couldn't talk to relatives all over the world. And Nepal actually has a very, very wide-ranging diaspora. And now they don't have access to talking to their children, to talk to their parents. So this is about so much more than just social media. Social media has become so ingrained within society that it's not about posting a quick video on TikTok or liking someone's post. It's about communicating. It's about business. It's about commerce. It's now a way of life. So almost to call it social media diminishes the value that it now plays in society.
I take your point, and in fact, you're starting to make me think of this dynamic. Going back to the Arab Spring back in 2012, 2011, Twitter, what it was called back then, X today, was one of the major tools that was used by protesters to organize. Facebook as well at the time. And the reason that this is so important is because not only were they able to project images and video and say the things that were happening, tell people to convene in different locations and organize through a medium. This was also one of the things that was fueling people in terms of being able to just move their cause forward. And now I fast forward to 2025 when I'm thinking a little bit more in terms of tech in general. So not just social media, but for example, the Palantirs, the Clearviews, and all of these companies that are actually working on the law enforcement side that are sort of the anti-protester technologies. And I'm also starting to think on the one side, you have tech billionaires that benefit from this traffic and movement that's happening on social media. Now you have other tech billionaires that are benefiting from this sort of security aspect. And I start thinking of the interest and importance of having all of this happening on primarily U.S. technology, by the way. And what are your thoughts when it goes to this dimension of we think that it's about people and their governments, but there's all of these tentacles that go above that, and they centralize power. Because we talk about Elon Musk, who gives satellite coverage to countries that don't have connectivity. We talk about the fact that many countries have actually had their social media turned off by technology companies and not by governments, which is an important factor because there's this sort of new third partner in this discussion.
It almost feels like in cases of conflict, tech companies will always be winners. So yes, you might have WhatsApp shut down, you might have Facebook shut down, you might have Discord shut down, but all that does is drive more people to your platform. All that does is convince people that they want to get there. They'll find a VPN, they'll do whatever it takes to get there. So that's on the consumer side of things. On the government side of things, we're now very much in the surveillance economy. There's nothing you can do without your government being aware. I mean, I think Snowden made that evident, and that happens worldwide. So it's in cases like this, in cases of civil unrest, global unrest, the real winners are the tech companies. I want to take this conversation in a different direction. As a tech company, as a social media platform, when you enter a country, do you think you should be in charge of content moderation?
I love the content moderation discussion. I actually think that tech companies should not be involved in content moderation. And I'll tell you why. The individual companies, tech companies especially, they oversee billions of users. That is in itself something that is quite miraculous when you think of it, not just from a tech stack perspective, but think of billions of people all congregating onto one space. It's virtual, but still it's very important and meaningful. But at the same time, global values are so diverse. I don't think that you can codify global values, even at the country level, because there are cultural values, there's religious values, there's individual values, and all of these are layers that even if you codify them, you can't get agreement. And this is the hard part because you were saying a few episodes ago, data can flow across borders so easily, but values, they can't. And I think this is the hardest part where we always hold many of these tech companies responsible. But I actually think that codifying values is an impossible exercise.
So then wouldn't it be in the government's best interest to shut these platforms down? If a platform isn't going to go through the effort of understanding these cultural values, of understanding the nuance. For example, in Canada, you probably shouldn't allow for people to talk about how great gun rights are, versus in the US, you can't take that down. That's a right. If a company is not going through the effort of understanding this, of realizing this, then why even allow them into your country?
By the way, from a government strategic perspective, I think that it's a clever move to cut off, even though it's unethical, but to cut off social media access for people, because in the end, the government is going to always try to stay in power. They're not going to relinquish power. If you're starting to see this movement, this uprising that's coming against you, you're going to try to cut it at its feet. And social media is probably the most viable option. This includes WhatsApp and everything else, but social media in general is an important thing to cut. So from a strategic perspective, I think that that's a right move. But from a values perspective, I still think that even if the tech company encoded your laws and your cultural values that the government has agreed that are the correct ones, and they encoded that and did content moderation on that, I still don't think that that is going to be a valuable practice, because even within that, you're going to have so much variability in the interpretation of laws, in the implementation of laws, and that kind of thing. And this is the part where the devil is going to be in the details. In its actual implementation, tech companies are not able to genuinely codify all of these different complexities of a specific culture, and then again, span it internationally.
I don't think we're in a position where countries are going to get rid of social media. We're way past that point. This might have happened earlier. It might happen in authoritarian states, but it's not happening. But what can happen is the content moderation piece. And I can't imagine living in a world where it's okay for people to write awful, awful things on social media. I'm talking about things related to assault, child abuse. I'm talking about things related to pornography, anything that is the most vile image you can conceive of. 100x that, and it's probably on the internet. 1000x that. So in a world of no content moderation, what type of social media platforms are we really allowing?
Let me be very clear. I do not think that this problem has a solution. I just think that it's an impossible problem. Because that's the challenge that I have. We know the content that's out there. And we also know all of these stories of content moderation teams for big tech companies that sift through millions of content, not just through the use of AI, but people literally looking at really vile stuff, as you were saying, and filtering it out. And while you can create a mechanism for it, it's always going to be imperfect. There's still going to be that person that does a live stream shooting that still gets through. In fact, so much so that recently I was reading that people are actually now starting to publish nudifying apps. So applications in which you can upload the photo of somebody and you can actually use AI to remove their clothes. And it's actually permeating through social media advertising. And the reason they do so is just because they keep changing the lettering in such a way that it is not going to be detected as, an English language, being published as an English language ad, but it's still not being detected as English language because they literally crumple up all sorts of letters, but the image is very clear of what it's going to do. You're always going to have people trying to game the system. But at the same time, even if you don't, you just cannot have a technical architecture that is going to be foolproof. And so there's a broken nature to what is content out there in which we have given people the key and freedom to communicate freely. And as a result, now we want to also say, by the way, this is the line. Actually, in that country, this is the line. And this is the reason I say, I just think it's an impossible problem. There's things that can be clearly out of bounds, but there's always going to be things that people are complaining about.
But that doesn't mean you don't do it. It's like AI regulation. Just because you're not going to capture all of the use cases, it doesn't mean you don't regulate it. It means you regulate the risks that you know exist. It means that you regulate the content that you already know is wrong. And you adapt it. It grows with time. Fine, now there's this new app. Guess what goes onto this list of content moderation things? Anything associated with this psychotic app that people might want to download for some reason. I don't think the answer is you don't have content moderation. I think social media platforms are taking the easy way out to be like, it's hard. We'll just leave everything up there. Or, you know what? We'll allow for people to self-regulate. You can just maybe flag it and someone will get to it in 2 to 200 business days. That's not a solution, especially when we have no real mechanisms in place for young children to be on these platforms. And now we're seeing more and more people turn to self-harm because of things that they're seeing on these platforms. There's got to be more that we can do. And saying that it's hard, it's just not enough. These are the smartest people in the world, isn't it? That's what we keep being told.
Yeah, but the smartest people for different purposes, right? And I think that you're absolutely right. And in fact, tech companies are making the attempt to do content moderation. But the problem is that again, I go back to the fact that it is an impossible problem. And so being held to account for failing to do strong content moderation is, in my opinion, something that is really hard. There is no country on the planet that is actually legislating across the globe. And I'm going to use the United Nations and the ICJ as one of the good examples, in which you do have practices that are global, that are good practices. You have the ICJ that has many of these different international laws that are really important to be upheld. But you have countries choose not to be part of the ICJ rulings. They choose also to ignore the ICJ rulings. And that is a breaking of international law. And this is in the face of the rules, right? And so this is the reason I say, if people want to get around it, they will. If governments want to get around it, they will. If companies want to get around it, they will. So how do you actually create a set of rules? How do you create a set of regulations that will actually protect the people when you know that human behavior, company behavior, and government behavior is still going to be not just self-serving, but is going to navigate around whatever you codify?
So understanding that take on content moderation, when governments order platform takedowns, is it ever the right move from a stability perspective? Or do you think it's always going to fuel anger?
I think that the current reaction for people, it's going to be anger. The question for me is whether it's been pent up. Because if it's something that happens just overnight, and it doesn't feel like it's connected to something else or a different narrative, I can imagine that people will be frustrated. Maybe someone will think it's an outage. And then at some point, it'll be brought back online. If it goes for days, if it goes for weeks, I can imagine that there's going to be some resentment. And depending on the cultural values, right? I think there's a distinction between Norway and, I don't know, Libya. I think that the cultural values will drive different behaviors. As a result, you may see some protests, but I can imagine that you can see more violence in some places than others. And the reason for it is not just because of social media. What ends up happening is people will tack on, and we saw this with many protests, people will tack on other issues and assign it to the protest. We saw this with Occupy. We see this also with the Nepal protest that's happening right now. We're starting to see this also with the anti-Macron protests that are happening in France, because it's not just against Macron. It's against the government. It's against the fact the prime minister keeps changing the budget, the cuts in the budget. People are pouring on their life's problems into these protests, and they're all going out there. And that disorganization is starting to translate really towards the fact that, you know what, I'm just unhappy.
And I think a lot of people are unhappy with the economy right now. This reminds me, in India, they banned TikTok a while ago, and we didn't really hear anything about it. I mean, people moved on. Maybe it's because Instagram is such a tenable alternative, as Zuck would say.
Actually, they created their own local TikTok. That was the outlet, let's say, that's resolved.
So that's what I was actually going to get at, is that by banning some of these technologies, maybe that spurs local innovation. Or in the case of the US, when they banned TikTok for like, a hot 24 or 48 hours, people started downloading this other app, Chinese app, to get back at the government, to show that they were so upset, because the US's entire raison d'etre behind why they banned it was because they didn't want Chinese infiltration within the US. What did Gen Z do in response in the US? They went and found another app from China to download. And it was like the #1 app for those 48 hours. So there is a way to respond. We have seen social media platforms being taken down by governments, and we have seen results which actually haven't resulted in very much discourse or instability. In fact, in India's case, I would say it led to innovation.
One of the things that does end up happening is that if it permeates for a longer period of time, the government is going to knock this at its knees in different ways. And what we've started to see is that some of the governments are starting to talk to app stores to curtail the behaviors that they have, the way that they rank apps and that sort of thing. And that's an important factor because, again, governments can play a completely different game. I want to transition us into the ethical piece here, because one of the other events that just happened, which I think is a very sad event, is the fact that Charlie Kirk, a very famous, and frankly speaking, I just learned about him, but a very famous Republican and Trump-aligned influencer, has been shot and killed. I bring him up because one of the things about what ended up happening is I still keep thinking about this death of discourse. And, he may have had his opinions, which I actually disagree with many of them. But at the same time, it's this inability of people to digest differences in opinion. And I think this is a huge problem that we're starting to have across society, across the globe. We also started seeing this at the European Parliament, where the right-wing politicians within the EU wanted to observe a moment of silence. And in the end, the left-wing politicians chose not only to deny them that 1 minute, but at the same time, it started to become a debacle. And the reason that I think that this is a problem is because on the one side, you're starting to see people that are more blindly following their choices, right? So, I can say this for Democrats and Republicans or left and right wing, it's just because you are on the other side, I will not side with you, even if it's for decency. I think that this is a problem that we're starting to have in which we're just picking teams and we're not, again, engaging in discourse. And for me, this is one of our age's biggest problems because I also think that this is heavily tech fueled.
It's heavily tech fueled because tech companies are rewarded with a number of eyeballs that are visiting certain pieces of news, certain pieces of media. So the more outlandish, the more outrageous a topic is, the more views it's going to get, which is why it almost feels isolating to not have a strong opinion on something, because when you open up your phone, everyone has a strong opinion on something. I get asked my opinion on things that I frankly do not care about. And I have now made it a case to just be like, sorry, I'm at max capacity of things that I care about. Like, there's a lot of other things happening in the world right now. But the fact that I even have to apologize for not having a strong opinion on something says a lot. We are in a world where not having an opinion and not taking a side and not being part of a team hurts you.
I like what you're just saying, because again, whether somebody agrees with you or doesn't, there should be this space, safe space for people to be able to talk about it, right? And I think there should be also this other safe space for people to be able to accept differences of opinion. And this is really being diminished. One of the things that I was thinking about when you were talking is how is it that technology is fueling this? One, technology is driving individualism. So we are now more self-centered than ever before, measurably speaking. And this is also because we are being portrayed images constantly about how we have to focus on growing our wealth, growing our education, being the best that we can be, being entrepreneurs, and our icons and our idols are the ultra wealthy, that sort of thing. There are no values that we are actually being asked to espouse, but we are talking value is what we need to be driving. At the same time, we're also being stuck in bubbles through search or filter or whatever it is. The more you stay in one of these social media platforms or search, you are ending up being served personalized content. And that personalized content is very much within this bubble that you're being placed. And as a result, it's just going to be feeding, your existing beliefs. Another one is, as you were saying, extremism, that the only things that succeed on social media right now are extremist content. No centrist content is doing well. And I think that's a problem because there is no end game here. We can only get more extreme. The normalization of extremism is just where we are. And so all of this for me is a problem because, okay, it could be fine if it was a week or a month, but we've been marinating in this for years. And so as a result, for me, one of the biggest challenges we have is that technology is going to continue to fuel this and take us in this direction.
Technology definitely plays a role, but I think we'd be remiss to not talk about how never before have the left and right been so far apart. Never before across the world does it actually make a difference who you vote for, because now who you vote for is a reflection of your values, of who you are as a person, which is why candidly, people feel justified to judge someone if they find out that they're a Republican or a Democrat, or in Canada's case, a conservative of a liberal. It's like, oh, so you value X over Y? You must be an awful person. And honestly, it's because this is what these parties have now started to stand for. They have started to stand for these extreme perspectives. So it's not all tech's fault. I would say, looking at it from a geopolitical landscape, it's also the way that the world is leaning now.
And the reason I bring up the death of discourse is because while we started talking about protests, the reason that I relate these two concepts together is that a protest is the death of discourse. It is basically people saying, you know what, you have not listened to me at all. I'm going to take to the streets. And again, you can agree or disagree with regards to whether it's effective, but I also don't think that protests are a communication medium that is sufficient, as you were saying earlier. And so we end up seeing a lot of this bubbling over because we see this across everywhere. People are just starting to talk at each other. And there's a bigger challenge as well. People that protest are typically the people that do not have power. And power today is just riding a high wave. There is impunity, and we see this. But moreover, the challenge that I'm seeing is that even if you have power, they're using brute force. And as a result, what we're seeing is, okay, so protest may feel like your only outlet. And as a result, you're also going to pay a heavy price for protesting. And there's many people that have died, not just in the Nepal protests, but in many others.
And they think of it as justified because they need to make their voice heard. Can you imagine how bad life must be that people are willing to risk their life? And you're right, gone are the days of diplomacy. We've talked about this. Gone are the days of talking about things, because now it's considered talking about your feelings, and that's too woke, and now we just shouldn't do that. Nepal's uprising began as a protest about a social media blackout, but it quickly became a reckoning with corruption and generational anger. For tech and geopolitics alike, the message is simple. Controls on digital speech can ignite far bigger fires than governments expect. Thanks for listening. Join us next week. New episodes drop every Tuesday.